and tonight we have got an ambassadors forum for you here today. It is great to see so many of you in the Mandela Auditorium here at UNC Chapel Hill. I would also like to welcome our large online Zoom audience. Once again, this is a hybrid event, in person and by Zoom. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at UNC Chapel Hill. This is our first Krasno event this semester. And as I'm on research leave this semester and should really be focusing on reading and writing and researching, there will only be one other Krasno event on the 19th of April. However, there will be many more exciting events in the fall semester. It is a great pleasure to welcome Ambassador Jean-Arthur Regibeau of Belgium to the Krasno Global Event Series at UNC. I would also like to welcome the Belgian Consul General based in Atlanta, Michel Gereptsov, and Belgium's Honorary Consul in North Carolina, based in Raleigh, Christoph Jensen. I would also like to mention Christian Forstner, the director of the Hans Seidel Foundation in Washington, D.C., and Klaus Becker, the founder and director of the North Carolina Zeitgeist Foundation in Charlotte. Both were absolutely instrumental in getting Ambassador Regibeau to Chapel Hill today. And it is also a great pleasure to welcome our Senior Associate Dean, Rudi Colloredo-Mansfeld. Rudi would like to introduce the Krasno series and tell you, hopefully, how good the Krasno series is. And Rudi is, of course, our Dean, Senior Associate Dean for Social Sciences and Global Programs, and is also a distinguished professor of anthropology here at UNC. Over to you, Rudi.
Thank you very much, Klaus. And it's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to see all of you stalwarts again at this event. It couldn't be more timely to convene ambassadors on this campus to lead us in a discussion. And it's really to the extraordinary credit of Professor Larres to be able to do this again and again, is to bring us together at a time when it's very urgent for us to understand international affairs. Of course, we gather at a moment of high stakes diplomacy with European countries and the United States seeking a peaceful path forward, most immediately with Russia, but also urgently with China. So I'm grateful to the Krasno team and especially to Professor Larres, who will continue to remind me that he is on leave, even as he does this important work. And start a conversation with an Ambassador Jean-Arthur Regibeau, Ambassador of Belgium to the United States, for us to pick up on these topics. So thanks again, Klaus, for bringing us together.
Thank you, Rudi, much appreciated. Thank you. This is indeed our 10th anniversary year. We have been organizing the Krasno events for the last 10 years. It's unbelievable how time has flown away, and we are still going strong. So hopefully we can look forward to the support of the college and the faculty and the deans for another 10 years of the Krasno Global Event Series. And as you know, the Krasno Event Series always deals with issues of global concern, both in past and present. Today, we will focus on the policy of both the United States and the EU toward Russia and also China. Not least in view of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, I'm sure we are all most interested in Ambassador Regibeau's insights about this increasingly dangerous situation. The ambassador will also tell us more about the influence a small nation such as Belgium has on decision-making within the European Union. As you will know, Belgium has a population of just under 12 million people. Its capital, Brussels, is host to many EU organizations, not least the EU Commission, and Brussels is thus often seen as a capital of a united Europe. Geographically, the country is squeezed between Germany and France. And Belgium, of course, is an important founding member of both the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the EEC-EU. Ambassador Jean-Arthur Regibeau is a representative of the Kingdom of Belgium in the United States and in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Ambassador Regibeau has had a very distinguished diplomatic career. Initially, he was a diplomatic advisor to the Minister of Defense and then First Secretary at the Belgian Embassy in Berlin. He was soon asked to run the private office of the Belgian Ministry of Defense in Brussels. And a few years later, he was appointed Director General in charge of multilateral organizations at the Belgian Foreign Ministry. And in 2016, Jean-Arthur Regibeau became Belgian ambassador to the Russian Federation and also to Armenia, Belarus, and Uzbekistan. And since September 2020, he has been Belgian ambassador to the United States. As you can see, the ambassador is an ideal person to enlighten us about the current US-Russian crisis regarding Ukraine and, of course, many other issues. After Ambassador Regibeau's initial talk, we will have a panel discussion on stage before opening it up to Q&A from you, the audience. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Ambassador Barbara Stephenson, who will join me to interrogate Ambassador Regibeau a little in our panel discussion. Since 2019, Barbara has been UNC's Chief Global Officer and Vice Provost for Global Affairs. And I'm glad to say that Barbara has become a strong supporter of the Krasno Global Event Series, and that is what we like, of course. In her previous life, she was a very distinguished US ambassador and also president of the American Foreign Services Association. As always, after our panel discussion, we welcome questions from you, the audience. If you wish to ask a question and you sit in the auditorium, then just raise your hand. Two of our excellent student Krasno assistants will rush to you and hand you a microphone. If you're viewing us online, then please submit your questions in writing by making use of the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Two other Krasno assistants, also very excellent Krasno assistants, they will select the questions and read them out aloud so that everyone can hear them, both online and in the auditorium. There are usually so many interesting and provocative questions. Unfortunately, we cannot answer them all, but we will do our best. Please mention your name and your location when asking a question. As always, we are videotaping our event today, and within a few days, you will find the video of this event today on our famous YouTube channel, youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. And of course, we also have a mailing list. If you're not yet on our mailing list, let us know, and we are happily putting you on it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you today to our Krasno event at UNC with the Ambassador of Belgium, Jean-Arthur Regibeau. Ambassador Regibeau will now talk about the United States and the EU and their cooperation and what to do about the geopolitical challenges we are facing from both Russia and China. Ambassador Regibeau.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a distinguished pleasure and honor to be invited to speak in front of you, and I hope that in the long American tradition, you will come after my introduction with challenging questions. Also, some things that Professor Larres forgot to mention is that we're actually neighbors, because Klaus was born and raised in Germany. I was born and raised in Belgium. We are neighbors, but not only two neighboring countries, but we just grew up a few dozen kilometers away from each other. And we meet in North Carolina. Is it not a beautiful thing? Now also a question I will have for you is you will have to tell me why the series is named Krasno series. Because with my background in Moscow, it means not exactly the same word, but actually Krasna means red in Russian. So Krasnaya Ploshad, for example, means the red square. So is there any interesting link over there? But now to the topic. First, let me talk of the EU, but also to begin with a warning. I'm not here representing the EU. I'm representing Belgium. It means I'm representing one of 27 member states. So whatever I say is in the name of Belgium, not in the name of the EU, even so. You will recognize in what I say many of the positions of the EU itself, because that's the trick. We agree, the 27 of us, on a common position that we then present to the outside world. Even so, it might not always be exactly our national position. It's a bit, if you want, like an ambassador of North Carolina coming to Brussels to give his view on US foreign policy, but also maybe something typical about North Carolina. That's very comparable. Now, something you have also to understand is that the two pillars of our foreign policy in Belgium has been for a long time, since the end of World War II, first, European integration. And I could expand on this topic in the Q&A later on. That's not the main topic for tonight. But for us, it means peace, prosperity, but also solidarity. And all these elements are very important. The second pillar is NATO. Belgium has been a founding member of the EU, but also a founding member of NATO. And when it comes to hard security, it's clear that we heavily rely on NATO, which means acting as a bloc vis-a-vis an aggressive outside world. And here, again, I want to stress that NATO is a defensive alliance, not with any aggressive intent vis-a-vis anybody. Now, with this preamble, let me first speak a bit about China. What is great, I think, about both EU and NATO, about democracies, we're all democracies. We all have our challenges, internal, but also when we work together. And it would be very surprising indeed if we had exactly the same opinion on all topics. I would even say it would not be very healthy if we had all the same meaning, the same views. I remember a famous sentence by Mario Cuomo 30 years ago, the governor of the state of New York, saying that, well, if we had only one opinion in the room, it means that only one of us would be thinking. And that's not good. Actually, democracy is exactly the opposite. We encourage every citizen to think about his fate and a common fate in society. And it's exactly the same in the society of nations. So we Belgians, we have our views, and we present our views in these bodies with our friends and partners, the EU, NATO. But what is very important is that we can come together to common conclusions. Doesn't mean that it represents 100% our position, but it does mean that we believe it's very important that we stay together on fundamental issues. And I think that when I will speak later on about Russia, we are exactly in one of these moments. But let me first speak about China. There is clearly a big challenge in foreign policy in Washington, D.C. Wherever you go, except maybe in the last few days, everybody would mention China as being the big challenge for the United States, a strategic challenge. It is nowadays also true on the EU side. It took maybe a bit more time to come to this conclusion on the European side, but there has been a remarkable turnaround in Europe about 3 or 4 years ago. And it translates, for example, in this new rule adopted at the EU level, that we should screen all foreign investment in terms of the security aspects. So obviously we welcome foreign investment, but we have to pay attention to the security dimension. Just an example, 5G, for a long time, the US has pleaded with European not to accept Chinese equipment when it comes to 5G because of all the data Chinese company and therefore the Chinese government could access through this system. And in a surprisingly fast period of time, European countries agreed. And for example, that's a decision we also took as an implementation of the European decision at the Belgian level to make sure that we would not have Chinese providers for the 5G system. Now, it does not mean that we see exactly eye to eye with the United States. Even within Europe, we have discussion about what our relationship with China ought to be. On the European side, we certainly also stress the need for dialogue with China. We don't give up on the possibility to cooperate with China on many issues, not just on climate change, for example. There is on the planet a nation with 1.2, 1.4 billion people that you simply cannot ignore. But, you know, in terms of principles, for us Belgians, we have exactly the same attitudes when it comes to our tiny neighbor, Luxembourg. Luxembourg might just have 600,000 people as a population, but still it's a country we do not want to ignore and we want to respect. That's a principle that should guide the behavior of nations. But we have noticed, indeed, like Americans, an increasingly aggressive rhetoric from the Chinese side, especially since Xi Jinping became the leader of the country. Now, if I was a bit more speaking in terms of political science, I would tell you, coming from the realistic school myself, that this evolution on the Chinese side was not particularly a surprise. I would rather say that the surprise for me was the surprising ease with which we accepted the not China rise as itself, because probably something natural, but it almost as we lent a hand to this rise by closing our eyes on many negative developments as well. And if I have to name a few, trade practice, stealing intellectual property, but also sometimes just legally acquiring our own intellectual property by imposing any Western companies to work in a joint venture with the Chinese shareholders that should anyway have more than 50% of the shares. And I could go on and on and on. So we just have to open our eyes on reality. Now, I would say as a European that these diverging views on China should not necessarily lead to confrontation with China. And we still pretty much hope that we can find a way of living peacefully together, agreeing on common rules. But of course, right now, we do not always agree on the same rules. And we have to make clear that some behaviors, like what's happening with the Uyghur minority, what's happening with the pressure on Taiwan or in Hong Kong, is not exactly welcome from our side. But there is also an increasing willingness to talk to each other across the Atlantic, also on this very important topic for both of us. And so there has been a working group launched across the Atlantic between Europeans and Americans, just to compare notes, to discuss our views, but also with the goal of having a common attitudes on many topics relating to our relationship with China, for example, let's say on trade rules. And this is a process that is going on, and I can assure it's very welcome on the European side. Now, let me turn to a topic that is more the topic of the day, that is Russia and Ukraine. And once again, I want to underline that we are at a very important moment. This is a serious situation we are facing currently about Ukraine. But also that we should not despair, because sometimes we make mistakes in the West. We have to be humble enough to accept it. But Russians also make mistakes. And for example, one of the mistakes Russians have been doing quite repeatedly in the last 10 years is underestimating the unity of the EU when it comes to a fundamental topic like this one. For example, you know, the rule divide ut impere, so divide and conquer, is as old as humanity. I just quoted a few words in Latin that dates back from the Roman period. And of course, the Russians try this tactic, the Chinese try this tactic, but sometimes they're surprised by the results. If I just take the example of sanctions taken by the EU in response to the annexation of Crimea, first, the Russians were surprised by the fact that we, the 28 countries at that point in time, were united in adopting these sanctions. And every time we renew the sanctions, because it has to be done every 6 months, they are surprised, because when they talk to some individual member states, they are being told, well, you know, we don't like these sanctions. I could name a few member states that are well known because it's public, that would come with public statements to that effect, saying that we don't like sanctions. And yet the very same countries, they do accept the renewal of the very same sanctions in the EU. And so that's something the Russians do not always understand. It's because probably even more than Americans, they have problems understanding the proper working of the EU and the internal dynamic we have among member states. The same could be said about what happened about the attempted murder on Mr. Skripal in the UK in 2018, a former Russian intelligence officer seen as a traitor, a renegade by the Kremlin, and he was poisoned by two members of the GRU, which is the intelligence from the military branch in Russia. And the Russians were also surprised by the strong reaction. They might have believed first that these people would go unnoticed. Putin even tried to tell us that these two people were just two Russian tourists visiting the beautiful cathedral of Salisbury. And you know what? Putin even told the anti-Russian public, well, you know, these are just tourists. And actually, from what I know, they will talk to the public and the press in a few days. And actually, the very next night, that was, I think, September 2018, so about 6 months after the fact, these two people appeared on TV, on Russian TV, but also internationally. And they tried to sell their stories that indeed they were just two Russian tourists visiting a beautiful cathedral. And you know what? These two people were just, they just had a lack of credibility that for us, it was just a confirmation that these two people were actually two GRU agents, but also Putin took a big risk. Because what I can tell you, because I was in Russia at the time, the entire Russian population was laughing about it. Because the president of the country, a very powerful man, he wants to appear strong, and being cuffed lying to the whole world. And that's the kind of situation a Russian president cannot allow too often to happen, because otherwise it would appear to be weak. And what you have really to understand about Russia is that the fate of the president is not decided in elections in Russia. Elections are just a rubber stamp. It's a managed democracy, as the Kremlin itself defined it. No, but the president is in danger when he appears to be weak, because then the system could change in a matter of weeks. It's nothing to do with elections. So the Russians were surprised by the extent of the answer. Is that, of course, as you could expect, the British government was not very happy, expelled a few Russian diplomats, at least pretending to be diplomats. But even so, we were well after the Brexit vote. There was a high level of solidarity from many other EU member states. And Belgium, among them, we also expelled one Russian diplomat, not exactly just a diplomat, like many of us. We choose carefully whom we expelled. The Russians were surprised, not by the fact that some of their diplomats had been expelled, but just by the size of the number of people who had been expelled. And as far as I know, the Russians are still trying to rebuild their spy networks in our member states. So even Russians do not always analyze the situation in a realistic way. But when I say that about the Russians, we also have to realize that on our side, we sometimes make exactly the same mistake, misreading the Russian attitudes, speeches, and reasoning. And that's probably one of the largest danger I perceive nowadays, is the risk of misperception on both sides. And I think it's our duty to try to understand the reality of Russian thinking behind everything we've seen publicly in the last 2 months. It's not just by happenstance that we come to this situation. Now, when I say that we try to understand the Russian position, I want to underline, because sometimes it's a remark or a comment I receive, when I say I try to understand, it does not mean that I try to justify Russian attitudes. That's a big difference. But when you are negotiating with someone, you have to understand the rationale on the other side of the table. Otherwise, it's almost impossible to find an agreement to a common problem. And this is one of this point in time where I think that we have to try to understand the Russian position. Just taking one aspect, when the Russians say that they feel threatened by NATO. I think that there is a high degree of sincerity in this statement, and we have to accept it. Even so, as I mentioned before, we defined NATO as a defensive alliance, and I can assure you, because I represent a government who is a member of NATO, we have absolutely no aggressive intention vis-à-vis Russia, zero. Of course, we have some criticism about the state of human rights in Russia and on some other topics, but these are disagreements, absolutely zero reason to go to war. And so, still, even so, if we do not have this intention, we have to accept that it is the perception on the Russian side, maybe not by all Russian citizens, but by a significant number of Russian citizens. I can be a witness of it when I was in Russia 2018 in June, just having a walk in the beautiful park of Peterhof, a beautiful palace near St. Petersburg. I was just talked to by a Russian policeman in Russian, because he could not speak any other language. And my Russian was still very poor, it's still not fluent nowadays, but at least I could understand what he said. And because I was devising in French with my daughter, and he came to me and said, "Oh, where are you from?" And I said, "Well, I come from Belgium." "Oh, Belgium." "Brussels." "Brussels, NATO." He just went from a positive expression to a very negative one. So Belgium was something positive. Maybe he was thinking about Belgian beer or Belgian chocolates, but Brussels evoked NATO. And then he started to speak, why do you need to have tanks 200 kilometers from my home? And I could see that he was animated and he was totally sincere. I could not answer. I could just barely understand what he was saying because my Russian was so poor. And in any way, it was not my intention to enter into a debate with a Russian policeman. I'm a visitor. It's his country, not mine. But at some point, he himself noticed that maybe he had been a bit too far. And then suddenly, he switched to speaking about the Red Devils, which is the national soccer team of Belgium, and saying beautiful thing about the play by the Red Devils. But so it means that when they speak of the fear of NATO, it's not just a statement by Vladimir Putin. We have to try to understand that. And I think that the US administration had the right reaction when they saw the two draft treaties published by the Russians in early December. We need to talk. And indeed, we need to talk. We need to understand each other better. And let's see if we can meet your concern without violating our own principle. I think that's the position of the West, the Western Alliance in this difficult situation. And there are now also proposals from both the United States and from NATO on the table. And representing Belgium, I can tell you that we strongly hope that these proposals and eventual negotiations will diffuse the current tension. And let me finish by underlying the two principles we are currently working with within the Atlantic Alliance. It's first the principle of dialogue, just I try to explain. We are really ready to listen to Russian concerns and try to meet them. But we also have concern on our own. For example, about Ukraine territorial integrity and security. We can listen to concern about Russian security, but then the Russians have also to listen to concerns about Ukraine security. And that's where we can find a balance. Now, there is also a second pillar of our strategy within NATO, and that is deterrence, which is equally important. And we have also to make clear to the other side, well, if something nasty happens, then we are ready to face this situation. And that's why currently, and already for quite a few weeks, there have been discussions among Europeans, but also between Europeans and Americans, as what should happen in case there was a renewed invasion of Ukraine by Russian troops. So, Professor, I suggest to stop here and tell you that I'm really open to all your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I would like to welcome Barbara Stephenson to join our panel discussion here. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. You expressed quite a degree of understanding for Russian perceptions of NATO and what is going on. You've been in a room with Vladimir Putin. What do you think are his intentions? Will he invade? Will he not invade? And what does he want to achieve in the end?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the immediate answer is I don't know. I can only bring elements for analysis. I'm not sure that Putin himself knows what type of instrument he will use. What is clear, and that's, I would say, a permanent tactic on his side, he has a wide range of options. He can use the most peaceful one, he can use also the most aggressive one. So he has all the palette. What he wants to achieve, I think that there are several aspects. Ones that are sincere and we can understand, and some that are sincere and we simply cannot accept. So I think that he's sincere when he's speaking of, I've seen across the last 20 years, NATO coming close to Russia's border, but also eventual membership is promised to both Ukraine and Georgia, and this is going simply too far. I don't want to see, for example, missiles from NATO on Ukrainian soil because they would just be a few minutes away from Moscow. They openly compare this situation to the Cuban crisis of 1962 in reverse, and they say, you did not accept it, why should we accept it? And I think that in this sense, there is a sincere wish to see NATO a bit further away from the Russian border. Now, there are also other elements that are much more difficult for us to accept, even to discuss. It is when he says that Ukraine is not even a country. This we simply cannot accept. It's not for the Russian president to speak about Ukraine, it's for the Ukrainian citizens. And it seems to me that the Ukrainian citizens are of a different opinion. And also when he mentioned a sphere of influence, we fully respect Russian pride, the Russian need for security, but I think that there is enough strong element in Russia itself, its history, its culture, its size, its resources, for this pride to be enough to satisfy Russian citizens without Russians believing that it gives them a right to govern people just across the Russian border. No, the fate of people across the Russian border must be decided by these people. Just like I would say the future of Russia belongs to Russians, I will say the future of Ukraine belongs to Ukrainians.
Thank you. Barbara, what is your assessment?
Well, I think my assessment, I very much appreciate you flagging that you think Vladimir Putin is sincere, partially sincere in his concern about NATO coming so close to Russia's borders. I think that is something that is worth listening to and thinking about. We keep talking about an invasion, and then we've had explorations, including by the American president, about what constitutes an invasion. A question I have for you, do you think that one of the things Vladimir Putin is seeking to do is to divide the West, to divide NATO, and that he'll do something short of a highly provocative full-scale invasion and do something that is less than that, and that then leaves that unity that you listed as your first pillar in disarray? What do you think about that possibility? Is that what he's up to?
I'm not sure. It might be one element in this series of options. That's something he might hope for. But frankly, based on my own experience, he ran a high risk of being disappointed.
I hope so.
No, I have more than a hope.
Can you say something more about that? When we read the press, and you may know much more than what we read in the press, there is Hungary, or the Hungarian prime minister meets with Putin next week, I believe. It's expressed skepticism about what the West is doing, NATO and other countermeasures. There is Nord Stream 2, and the Germans have been criticized for being lukewarm about standing up to Russia. And there are other countries within the EU who may not be as strong and hardline as the United States, for example, wants them to be. That sounds to me like a division of the transatlantic alliance, not like unity and coherence. How does it sound to you?
It's because, in my view, you're much expressing a defeatist view. I'm much more positive about it. I come back to what I said about democracies. I think it's a good thing that we have different opinions. And actually, I would even say it's our strengths, because we are talking to each other and we're listening to each other. Something Putin is not doing because he's the single leader in the Kremlin. And he might be surrounded by thousands of advisors, but they all want to please the great leader. Not so on our side. We are much more frank, honest. Also, we are much more transparent, which is not true of the Russian system. You know, to read across the walls of the Kremlin, it's difficult. Not so on our side, but it makes us, I think, much more confident about who we are, and we know that we have a community of friends. And when I meet friends, I would not agree with the Hungarian leader on every topic, far from it. But when it comes to Russian sanctions, Hungary is one of these countries going to Moscow to say, well, we don't like the European sanctions on Russia. And yet, every 6 months, they approved it. Why? Because even the Hungarian leader understands what is at stake. And it is something fundamental, not just for him politically, but for the entire Hungarian population who still want to be a member of the European Union. It's the same with Poland. In Poland, we have a government that is very skeptical of the EU, even pushing judges to say that Polish law is above European law. But even this government would not go to organizing a referendum on Pole exit, so Poland out of the EU, because they know they would be utterly defeated. So, you know, that's our strength. It relies on the will of the people. And indeed, we might have different priorities. For example, when I talk to my Baltic colleagues, Lithuania, let's say, I do understand that they feel more threatened than I do in Brussels because I'm much farther away from the Russian border. I don't have a common border with Russia. Lithuania does in Kaliningrad. But I'm also I'm trying to understand the Lithuanian point of view. But on my side, I'm also trying to explain the fact that we should not leave the dialogue option. It's also a worthwhile option to be exploited to the full, because the consequence of not exploring dialogue might be catastrophic, not just for the Lithuanian, also for me. And I think that we are a much stronger community when we have this type of exchange, a fully democratic exchange, but at the end, we agree on the fundamentals. And the fundamental in this topic is the future of Ukraine is to be determined by Ukrainians.
Thank you. Well, I think when you look at Hungary and what's going on in Poland, I think there is disagreement about the democratic fundamentals. But my question is, in the end, do you believe sanctions will be subscribed to by all European nations if they indeed get enforced?
Yes, but I'm not in the secret of the current negotiation. I could not tell you what sanctions now. But will the sanctions be forceful? Definitely yes.
And everyone will agree with them.
Yes. Yes.
Good. You're very optimistic.
No, I'm just basing my answer on experience.
Okay. Tell us about Nord Stream 2. Should they be abandoned? Should it be continued? What should we do with Nord Stream 2?
Well, in the context of the current crisis, I think it has been already clearly mentioned, even by the German government, that in case there is a renewed invasion of Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 will also be on the table.
I think this point you make, that history shows us that even when individual member states in the EU do not really support sanctions, the way that the EU works leads to unity and cohesion. I think this is such an important point. And we've ended up deciding that sanctions will be the instrument that we will bring to bear, the United West here, not just because it's less bloody than the other options, but it actually sounds like it is a very strong and effective way to bring some leverage into the situation and insist that Ukraine does not have to give up its rights as a sovereign country. I think that's a really, really vital piece of thinking to put into this, because sanctions sound like a lighter option than doing something more forceful. So I love that piece of it. How do we square this circle with Ukraine being a sovereign country? And that's an important point, and they should be able to decide whether to pursue NATO membership. And Vladimir Putin's sincere fear and Russian sincere fear about having NATO at the door. You know, you do have American officials, Bill Burns among them, and you can see it in his book, The Back Channel, who says he understands why Putin believes that assurances were given after German unification that we would not roll NATO right up to Russia's borders. But no one can find any paper trail on this. Do you think that there is a form of words that preserves the integrity of a variety of positions, the US position, the Western position, Ukraine's, that can be found?
Yes, I firmly believe it is possible, but it does not only depend on us, it also depends on the Russians and on the Ukrainians. But you mentioned that Ukraine has the right to decide to join NATO or not. But I want to emphasize that Ukraine will not be alone in deciding. All member states of NATO will also have to agree. And there is also a clear sentence in the Atlantic Charter that any new members has to contribute to Atlantic Alliance security, right? So it's a duty for all members. And the decision in 2008 is worth remembering. We said that Ukraine and Georgia will eventually join NATO. Could be tomorrow, could be in 2,000 years. So we are still the masters of the agenda. That's a very important element. Now, is there a way to reconcile? I think so. For example, if we can find a way of meeting Russian concern, but also Ukrainian concerns. And one way of doing it is finding an agreement for the crisis in Donbass. I think it's not by happenstance that there has just been a meeting of the Normandy format in Paris with France and Germany, but also Ukrainians and Russian around the table. And so if we can find a satisfactory answer to this crisis that could improve trust on both sides, on the Russian side and on the Ukrainian side. And that could be a key to a solution.
How could a solution be found for Donbass? What are the options? Because there is a Minsk agreement and the Ukrainian government has for years essentially refused to implement it because it would take autonomy away from the central government in Kiev and hand it over to a regional government authority in eastern Ukraine. So how can that be overcome?
So first, we have to recognize a fact. The Minsk agreements have been signed by both sides. It has never been ratified by the Ukrainian parliament, which certainly create uncertainty on the Russian side as well. So when I'm speaking of the Minsk agreement, it means that both sides must contribute to implementing the agreement as it is. It might be imperfect in some respect, but if it is signed, it has to be honored and implemented. You know, you're speaking to an ambassador representing a federal country. So if you ask me, is it something possible to transform Ukraine into a kind of federation with some regions being having a degree of autonomy in some respect? It's nothing strange to me. Well, just look at this country, the United States. Not everything is decided in Washington, D.C. It could also be the case in Ukraine. But it's for the Ukrainians themselves to decide, but also to exactly define the modalities of such a local autonomy. For example, if we just speak of COVID, it's just normal here in this country that rules varies from one country to the other. The same in Europe. We don't have the same rules in Lisbon and in Helsinki. So it might be a way forward. Then, of course, that also requires efforts from the Russian side. For example, that they stop pretending that the Ukrainian government should only talk with people in Donetsk and Lugansk because it does not correspond to reality. So I would say that's the typical start of a negotiation where both sides have to be willing to come to an agreement.
Good, but the problem is to get there. Do you see any possibility that both sides will move towards each other and find that compromise?
I would say that there is a narrow road, but the road there is.
Right. You are an optimist, are you not?
I'm willing to look for all opportunities to solve this crisis.
If, as you say, the Western camp isn't really interested in having Ukraine and Georgia join NATO, and I fully agree, Putin would know that. So why is he so concerned about Ukraine joining NATO? Isn't that like an artificial fake crisis if he knows that the West doesn't really want both countries to join NATO?
No, this question we raised with a few colleagues with the Russian ambassador in Washington during a lunch, and he was asked why now? And he answered, because we have seen the trend. And even South Ukraine is not yet a member of NATO. We've seen an increased level of military activity by NATO countries in Ukraine. And we see it as a continuity of the trend we have seen for the last 20 years. And now is the time to say stop, because maybe in a few years, it will just be too late to stop the trend. That's an argument I can hear. For example, when the Russians say, we don't want to see NATO missiles in Ukraine, well, I would not like to have nuclear missiles next to my home either. But then we have also to mention, okay, we try to understand your concern, but what about our own concern? And so please also listen to our concern. And if we can find an answer to issues on both sides, we might come to a better situation.
Thank you. Just one more question before I hand over again. Is there something else apart from that? Is there also a feeling, a perception in Russia and also perhaps in China of Western weakness, of American weakness? You look at the pandemic, you look at the depolarization in American society, the Capitol insurrection, you look at economic difficulties, you look at all sorts of things. And did Putin come to the conclusion, the West is weak, if I move, I should move now?
Well, once again, frankly, I don't know. The more so because I've not been in Russia for 16 months. But it's entirely possible, and it would be coherent with his public statements, at least what he tells his own population, that the West is degenerated, is decadent, is led by homosexuals, it's anarchy. Look at all these demonstrations in their cities, whereas we in Russia, we have a strong political system, stable, and we have law and order. So it could be part of his reasoning, yes.
Thank you, Barbara.
A tactical question. Whose side is time on? You know, further dialogue will take time. I'm all for further dialogue. You and I are diplomats. This is what we do. But does Putin have a window that he needs to act within, or is he getting such a boost out of being in the international limelight, negotiating again, as in the glory days of the Soviet Union, as a co-equal with the other great power, the United States, that the longer he keeps this going on, he's benefiting from that? How does it play out? I understand the marshes will fall eventually, and the tanks won't roll in. So how do you see the timeline playing out in terms of his calculation?
Well, once again, it's just analysis because I do not
I
know.
know.
But I think that he took so many actions in the last few weeks that he cannot wait another 6 months. He needs to book a result. Which result exactly would satisfy him, I don't know, once again, but he needs something to show for his actions because first he deployed so much military equipment and so many soldiers, but also the political action of publishing 2 draft treaties, maximalist, fully knowing he will not get everything in it, but clearly hoping for at least part of it. It means that first he's really serious, is ready for a period of tensions, but he cannot wait for years until there is at least some type of result.
Do you see the recent crisis in Kazakhstan, also what is going on with Lukashenko in Belarus, the recent migrant crisis and all the upheavals in Belarus? You see there is a connection with the Ukraine crisis or not?
No. It just development in the respective countries, giving the situation in these countries, they are not to be related with the crisis in Ukraine. They might provide an opportunity for the Russian side that it weakened the position of Lukashenko in Belarus so that he has just to accept the positioning of more Russian troops on his territory. But that's the only link I would see.
All right. Between China's position and outlook on global politics and the Taiwan question, will there lessons to be drawn from the Ukraine crisis? Do you see there is some kind of influence going to happen?
Well, once again, this I don't know, but what I am sure of, even without talking to Chinese or being in Beijing, is that the Chinese are watching very closely any development in the current situation.
We all do, are we not? That's not a surprise. What is the Chinese position to the current crisis? Are they neutral?
Publicly, they take the same arguments as Russia, but I would not say that they make it a high profile of it, but the arguments they are using publicly are more from the Russian side, clearly.
You mentioned a lot about China at the beginning of your talk, and what is your position? Should we take a hardline view towards China, as many particularly Republican representatives in Washington advocate, but also the majority of Democratic representatives? Or should we have a perhaps more careful policy like a lot of people accuse Germany of taking towards China?
I think that it's always a challenge for us, first because we are a group of countries rather than a single country, and we are open democracies, open societies. I think that we should at least strive to be more coherent. For example, if you look at sanctions from the European point of view, actually it's not difficult for Americans to speak about sanctions on Russia. If you look at the level of trade between the U.S. and Russia, it's 10 times less than the level of trade between the EU and Russia. So who is most likely to pay the price for sanctions? Europeans, not Americans. And when it comes to China, well, maybe not a surprise, then you don't hear many voices in Washington clamoring for sanctions against China because the U.S. economic interests are much higher when it comes to China and across the board. So we have to be aware of this type of difference when we talk to each other. Now, I think that when I say we have to be coherent, I think that's a very positive aspect of talking to each other, American and Europeans. For example, I mentioned trade rules. I think if we can take common positions, Americans and Europeans, we're in a much stronger position to make sure that China will comply with World Trade Organization rules. And that's just an example.
These days, we seem to rely a lot on sanctions, be it Russia, be it China, be it whoever. That seems to be our only weapon, of course, better than arms and tanks. But are they actually effective or are they only effective in the very long run rather than within a few months or so? Do you approve of sanctions? Is that a good instrument of policy?
Well, first, if you have any alternative, please mention it.
Let me think about it.
Yeah. Second, I do not think is this the the key to all situations. No. But rather than just relying on sanctions, especially if I describe the situation now around Ukraine and the problems we have with Russia, I think that a very strong argument we have to use on our side is resilience. Because clearly what the Russians are hoping to do is not just to sow division between our countries, but also within our societies. And they are fueling the flames. But it is entirely to us to accept this provocation or not. But this challenge would exist even outside Russia possible actions. The Russians just make it a bit worse. But it's entirely to us to face down that challenge. And so when we think of foreign policy, the first strength is domestic. We should realize this, all of us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Barbara and I, when we talked about this session, we also agreed that we wanted to know about Belgium's role in the European Union, Belgium's role in world politics. As I said in my introduction, as we know, Belgium is a small country, but often small countries can be quite important between the superpowers. Can you give us some insights about that?
Well, it entirely comes from who we are and our history. For example, if I'm here, because I've been invited by Klaus, it was to speak about the Élysée Treaty, a treaty of friendship between France and Germany. And probably the French and the Germans were very happy about this treaty. I can tell you the Belgian maybe even more, because the French and the Germans had the bad habit of coming to Belgian territory to fight each other. Just think of Waterloo, right? It's 15 kilometers south of Brussels. And so we just love it when both our neighbors are friends rather than enemies. And so it's natural for us to come to an international roundtable and try to find a solution where everybody could be happy. So I would define our role as being bridge builders, right? We know war. We have seen so many wars on our territory, among them World War I, World War II, last century, involving many people in my own family. We don't like war. War is the instrument of last resort when you are attacked from the outside, and deterrence is a good way of trying at least to prevent it. And solidarity is the answer when we are actually aggressed from the outside. But Belgian diplomacy has clearly as an objective to support solidarity, which means that we have to find our common positions. And that's what we do both within NATO, within the EU. We have our own point of view, but we will also strive to arrive at a common conclusion, because that's only with a common point of view that we are really strong. We need to be united to be strong. And that's particularly true in this moment in time.
From neighbor to neighbor, can you give us some kind of concrete examples where Belgium has made quite a difference within the European Union to shift it or decision-making into a certain direction?
I would take an example of NATO, because it's even more telling, especially in the current situation. I mentioned both dialogue and deterrence. Well, actually, this was the work of a Belgian foreign minister back in, I think it was 1968. He was the guy who proposed this dual principle to NATO, and it has been adopted by NATO, and it has been our guiding line ever since. So we need to be ready to defend ourselves and to deter any aggression, but we should also be ready to enter into a dialogue to find common position with other countries.
Thank you very much. Do you have a final question?
I think I would like to shift to China for just a minute and get back to this transatlantic working group that you mentioned and welcomed, and talking about what are the biggest issues or the first issues, the most urgent issues that you believe we should tackle in this dialogue to get unity on trade rules with China? Is it emerging technology? Is it intellectual property? How should we go about actually getting a more constructive framework in place?
So in that respect, I must admit I'm not an expert, and so I will pass on this topic because I'm not knowledgeable enough.
That's completely fair.
But how intensive has that working group been meeting or been talking to each other? Do you know?
Well, even the regularity of meetings, I'm not following. I just have too much to do. I just know that it is going on. And the mechanism is Belgian diplomacy is contributing to the EU thinking, and then EU representative will meet with American representative. It might seem to be a lengthy process, just like it is within the EU. But on the other end, when we come to a conclusion, it's a powerful one because it has been prepared at length.
During the Trump administration, we all complained that transatlantic relations were falling apart. Do you think that has been rectified, that has changed?
The atmosphere is totally different. We still have some issues across the Atlantic, especially in the economic field, trade relations. We also have different views on digital tax or data privacy, for example. But there is a clear willingness on both sides to come to common solutions.
Sounds good to me. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you, Barbara. And I think we now should really urgently open it up to questions from the audience. Can I ask people in the Mandela Auditorium to raise their hands if they have a question? And here this young gentleman has already raised his hand. And we will also take questions from our Zoom audience in a minute as well. Yes, please.
I know you talked a lot about the US, China, and EU, but how do you think Belgium and EU should interact with other rising powers in the world? For example, right at the EU's doorstep, Turkey, or for example, India, they are rising powers in their own regards, maybe even Iran. How do you think the EU and even Belgium should interact with these powers? I'd really like to hear from you.
So that's clearly part of the path we have chosen as Belgium. As member of the EU, we believe that we should interact with these other countries through the EU. So we might have some bilateral questions to discuss with these countries, but mainly strategically, the main issues should be discussed at the level of the EU. That's also the principle of solidarity. We believe that it will be much more fruitful, but probably also more balanced if we deal with these powers from an EU perspective. Now, the vision of the EU is that, and maybe coming from Belgium, which is a former colonial power, is that, all Europeans are just fed up with this imperial dimension. That's something that is well past this generation and for the future. We just want to establish another type of relation with the world, which is of partnership. And let's see where we can benefit from each other. And that's something we can much more easily do at the level of the EU, because Belgium is just a country of 11 million. We have so much to offer, but when you speak of the EU, an EU of 450 million, we have a lot to offer. And it's not just in terms of resource, but in terms of cooperation. And that's really the offer from the EU side. It might be about trade. It might be about improving our common situation with global challenges like climate change. We are willing to discuss human rights dimension, fully understanding that we have our own perspective, which is not entirely shared, at least by everybody on Earth, but let's talk about it. And I think that if we have this type of fruitful and positive dialogue, both sides will be better off.
Thank you. I think we take another question from the audience. Yeah, this person over there. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Hi, I have a quick question regarding something I've heard in the news, which is that the U.S. is providing lethal aid to Ukraine. And I was wondering what your opinion was on whether or not that is a wise choice, or does this further validify Putin's semi-sincere fears of NATO force closer to the Russian border, or is this actually enabling Ukraine to the right to defend its sovereignty? What do you think, I guess your opinion, Belgium and the EU's stance is?
As far as I know, the EU as such does not have a stance on it because it's much more a national decision. It's not even a NATO decision. Also, my understanding is that equipment provided to the Ukrainians are of a defensive nature, not of an offensive nature. Now, this being said, that's certainly one topic where there is no unanimity among NATO allies. And indeed, you can have arguments on both sides. Some people say that the Ukrainians should have all the equipment necessary to defend themselves in case there is an aggression that did not yet happen beyond Crimea and Donbass, which is bad enough. Other people would just say, well, indeed, it's just adding oil to the fire. And anyway, the Russians are much more powerful and are able to do much more than match the additional equipment we are sending to Ukraine. So that's the kind of debate we have among allies, and allies do not all have the same answer.
Thank you. Can we have a question from our online Zoom audience?
All right, we have a question from Alan Marsh, and he would like to know what your opinion is on the formation of a united European army, and if you think that that may happen in the coming decades.
United European Army.
So, you know, it reminds me a poll we organized back in 2000 in Belgium, because in 2001, it was for Belgium to have the rotating presidency of the EU. And I was then working for our defense minister. And we asked, among many other questions, the Belgian citizens, are you a supporter of having a European army? Well, I would say that on the principle, the answer was something close like 95% yes. But much more surprising was that more than 60% of Belgian citizens believe we already had a European army. Which is so far from reality, because the only thing we had, and we still have, is the Eurocorps. And the Eurocorps is just a headquarter of a few hundred officers and non-commissioned officers based in Strasbourg. It is not related to the EU. It just covers 5 or 6 member states, among them Belgium, yes. But it has nothing to do with the real armed forces. We principally in Belgium, we support the idea. Why? Because it's almost senseless for a small country like Belgium, a small country of 11 million, to try to cover the whole range of the military equipment and capabilities we need. In the modern world, we need much more than that. Also, we believe it is frankly stupid to have 27 member states of the EU buying 27 times the same thing. It is much more expensive, it is inefficient, and we are not always being complementary to each other. There are redundancies, there is a total waste of money, and so we are not delivering exactly the equipment and the military capabilities we need when we spend individually, just common sense, right? So for Belgians, it makes total sense, but it's also because Belgium is the country, together with Luxembourg, where we clearly support the idea of a political union, the United States of Europe, if you want. We even have a former prime minister who wrote a book with this title, and that's really represent Belgian opinion. But we're also aware that we're in a union of 27 member states. We need to convince the 25 others, besides Luxembourg. That will not happen anytime soon. Let's be clear. And since we still defend our opinion, we're also utterly pragmatic as Belgians. And so we say, well, you know, every centimeter we are moving forward, we are closer to our goal of going 10 meters further. And it's exactly the same about the idea of a European army.
Thank you very much. What about the 2% dedication of GDP to defense? Is that a good idea or should it be reduced because hardly anyone gets there?
Well, quite a few countries do, including in Europe. And I think that we should not see the 2% as an absolute number. It's an objective. And for example, I can tell you that what it has produced in my country, Belgium, we were spending about 1% of GDP on defense. And now we have had successive governments, but the objective of the current government is to reach 1.24 in 2024. So clearly the line is there, so that we realize, we all accepted the idea that we need to invest again on defense equipment, capabilities, but also people. And that's one of the major challenges we face in our defense department. It might be very good to have equipment, but we also need the right people to operate the equipment. And that, for example, raised the issues of salaries for soldiers. And so when we just say we need to spend more, it's not just the solution. We have to know not only how much we spend, but as I mentioned about the idea of a European defense policy, how we spend this money. And we have to pay attention also to the best way possible to spend this money. And according to us, it's also through increased European cooperation in the field of defense.
Thank you very much. Can we have another online question, please?
Yes, thank you for speaking with us this evening. We have our next question from Scott Schwartz, who is joining virtually from Needham, Massachusetts. And he is curious if it's possible that Russia would like to be more involved in Ukraine, primarily because of its natural resources and nothing to do with NATO, or less to do with NATO.
Well, you know, like any country with imperial ambitions, I guess the more you control, the better you feel. But I would not see this as an immediate reason for the current crisis, no.
Thank you. Can we have some more questions from our in-person audience here in the Mandela? Any more questions? There's a over there, please. Yeah. There we are.
All right, so Ambassador, you talked about the idea of a federation in Ukraine and how it doesn't sound so bad to your ears as a Belgian. It doesn't sound so bad to mine as an American. I thought that maybe a solution to the Donbass crisis and Crimea also be something similar to the UK with Northern Ireland. I think there's similarities to be drawn. Both are economic liabilities and tremendous fiscal liabilities already for Russia. They've sunk billions of dollars and they've gone to waste. And I think it's really of more political worth, much like Northern Ireland is of more political worth to the UK. I think it's a far out question, but I would like to ask it of whether or not you see that as a solution of like Donetsk, the Donbass and like Crimea becoming something like oblasts for Russia, one of their more many, and that being something of a permanent solution to this crisis that is, you know, what is it? Ceasefire, not ceasefire, ceasefire, not ceasefire. No real hope in sight for anything concrete. It's something.
Well, I have to remind you that I am Belgian and not Ukrainian. I think that really your question has to be answered by Ukrainians. What I can talk about is the type of federalism we have in my country, in Belgium. It is elaborate. I would say it's even very original. We are probably world champion experts in constitutional law, and we can offer our experience. But decisions in such a case can only be taken by Ukrainians themselves because they will be the one to implement it. And if you do not agree with the system will not work anyway. So really it's for Ukrainians to decide. I think that there is one dimension we are very sensitive to as Belgians is the language issue. We understand that more or less, I don't know the exact number, but about 1/3 of the Ukrainian population has Russian as a mother language. That's also something we have to take into account. We have to respect that. It's part of the rights of minorities. And in this respect, we, Belgium, we would refer to the Venice Commission, which is a commission under the authority of the Council of Europe. You can understand that in my country, language legislation is very sensitive. I understand it can also be very sensitive in Ukraine. But if you come to a good understanding between linguistic communities, you clearly ease the path towards a political solution.
Thank you. What about Crimea? Is Crimea lost for good?
Well, frankly, I hope not, because we've been clear enough in our condemnation of annexation, because it was a forceful annexation realized through the use of military force. That's something we Belgians, Europeans, we simply cannot accept. You cannot change borders through the use of the military. Now, there is also a right in the UN Charter about the right to self-determination. And we accept it for the entire world, but there are conditions to be fulfilled. And the Russians, in the way they annexed Crimea, have violated so many of these principles that we simply cannot accept it. Now, it's both for Ukrainian and Russians to talk about it, but primarily also for the inhabitants of Crimea itself.
Thank you. I thought there was another question here. Yeah, this gentleman.
So Ambassador, you mentioned how you're confident in the potential for economic sanctions to be a solution to the current crisis, but
I didn't say it was a solution.
or a way to offer deterrence, at least. In the Crimean annexation, despite sanctions, obviously the West was not able to prevent Russia from annexing Crimea. So what makes this time different, and why will Putin simply not be able to achieve exactly what he wants to achieve territorially like he did in Crimea?
Well, first of all, because there is probably a difference between Crimea and the rest of Ukraine. We have to recognize that pro-Russian feeling is something important in Crimea. The exact percentage I cannot say, because we do not recognize the result of a referendum organized with soldiers in the street, right? And we saw the agreement of the Ukraine government. But we have to recognize that it's possible that it might represent a majority of the population. Not so in the rest of Ukraine. My own feeling about Donbass, because I visited the place, but it was before the violence started in 2014, is that the primary goal of the people over there is to live in peace. And they are just fed up with the violence, whoever is responsible for it. Is sanctions the appropriate answer? It's a bit frustrating because it's probably not enough. But I can also mention what we decided about Crimea, is that we do not recognize this annexation. And you might say, well, it's just a piece of paper, just a rule of law. Well, it might be very important. Just remember what happened with the Baltic states. They were annexed by Stalin in 1941. We decided that was totally unlawful, not legitimate. We never recognized this annexation. And so when the Soviet Union dissolved in 91, it was very easy for us to welcome back these three countries in the concert of nations. You see, it can have long-term consequences, just the fact that we do not recognize it.
Thank you. Can we have some more online questions?
Yes, our next question is from Tajay Artis, who asks how United States democratic backsliding, or the perception that some of our democracy is maybe crumbling around the edges a little bit, has affected our diplomatic relations with Europe, and how Europe views the United States.
Oh, Europe?
How Europe views the United States.
Well, I can assure you that there is a consensus in our populations and across the 27 member states that we want, I would even say we need, a strong relationship with the United States. Now, the question of who is the leader of the US is not for us to say, it's for American voters. But it is true to say that sometimes we do have concern when we see the current state of democratic practice in the US. And we are a bit worried, because whatever happens in that respect in the United States will have an impact not just for you Americans, but also for all of us democratic supporters in Europe. And it's for Americans to discuss, to decide. But I think that when it comes to basic democratic principles, we all Democrats on this planet, we also have a right to say that we are worried and we would like to improve the current situation. Also, because we face some of the same challenges in our own countries. Americans should realize they're not the only ones on earth among democracies to face these challenges. We also have our own challenges in Europe. And rather than just complain about it, let's talk about it.
Thank you. Can we have another online question, please?
Yeah, sure. So he says, we read of the EU's misgivings and about how the US and the reliability of its word and commitments has kind of faltered. How does the US, or how does the EU, my apologies, how does the EU adapt to Trump and now Biden's policies?
Well, maybe it's a bit vague, but let me try to offer an answer. First, once again, I'm not speaking in the name of the EU, just one of the member states. Second, once again, it's not for us to determine who is the US president. It's for American voters. So whoever is elected in the White House, we have to adapt. And we do. Now, depending on the policy of the US administration, we have to adapt in various ways. For example, if we have an American administration saying that maybe Article 5 is not that important, it just coming back to a boomerang to us, saying, well, maybe we have to face a situation some point in the future where we'll be alone without America. So what would we do in that case? Well, at least it is a question. Now, of course, when we have an administration saying that Europeans are the best allies we have and there is nothing we can do without you, we feel more comfortable. That, I think, that's nothing surprising, right? But we all agree within the EU that the most important bilateral relationship we have in the world is with the United States of America. And we want to have as good a relationship as possible.
Can I ask you, the prospect or the likelihood, some would say, of a return of Trump or someone like him at the next general election, how is that influencing European or Belgian policy towards the United States? Is there not a new element of insecurity and uncertainty which wasn't there before?
No. First, because it's much too soon to speak about who's going to be elected in 2024. And second, because the challenges we face in Europe, we have to face whoever is in the White House. And the only question is, in how far could we do it in tandem with the US, or in how far do we have to rely on our own strengths alone in Europe? Clearly, our wish is to do it in tandem with America. But if need be, well, we are all realistic. As I said, we are pragmatists. We have to take care of reality, and we have to face our own challenge anyway.
Mm-hmm. But isn't Macron's idea about European sovereignty or autonomous strategy, strategic autonomy, I mean, isn't that based on the idea that America is less certain a partner than it was before?
No, that's an idea that has been living in Europe, not just in France, for a very long time. And actually, we were speaking of a European army. That project existed in 1954. You see, I was not even born. Belgians fully supported the idea. And the idea came from France. But maybe if you know that part of history, you also know who killed the idea. French Parliament, right? So sometimes we are not always coherent on our side of the Atlantic either. But the idea of a European autonomy, you have much more to read in the light of the idea of the European pillar, as mentioned by President Kennedy, also a long time ago. I.e. what we want, and you know, if that's also my way of understanding the goal. For example, de Gaulle never said he want to be out of NATO. He just went out of the military part of NATO, never out of the political alliance. And actually now the French are back in the military structure already for almost 15 years. What we want is a strong European pillar within a strong Atlantic alliance, and then we should all be happy. That's a typical Belgian view. That has been our view for what, 70 years? We did not change our mind. The only challenge we have is how to transform it into reality.
Thank you. We have some questions from the audience. This lady over there, please. Yeah.
I was just wondering how UK works now with the EU. How are they fitting into this picture of figuring out how to work together?
Do you have any particular field in mind, or is it just a general question?
I mean, before they were part of the EU and saying, how are we going to come together with Russia? I would assume they care about this as well, but how are they as a part of the negotiation of how the EU is going to present themselves or how Europe's going to present? I mean, they're still Europe. That's a bad question. So I'm just wondering how they fit into all this negotiation now.
I'm just trying to understand the meaning of your question.
Well, it sounds like the EU is working together to say sanctions. How are you going to deal with that? Working with the US. Is Britain or is UK part of this as well? Of how they're going to approach Russia?
Well, yes.
China and
yes, we're also discussing with NATO allies. So this is an issue we're discussing within the EU, within NATO, and between the EU and the US. Because we have to coordinate. We have to make sure that one decision taken in one framework will not be contradicted by another one. We strive to be coherent, right?
okay.
And
So it's through the NATO. It's through NATO that they're a part of a cohesive strategy.
But also bilaterally, because that has been, for example, a positive surprise for us, Belgium, is that in some fields, there is a renewed interest for bilateral cooperation between the UK and Belgium, something we didn't see for decades. And we welcome it because for us, we were disappointed by Brexit. But, you know, Britain is still just 60 kilometers away from our coast. And Britain is still a democracy. So we want to increase cooperation wherever it's possible. And this is, as I said, a very serious situation, and we need to show coherence. Yes.
What's the reason for that new interest of the UK and Belgium?
Well, this you would have to ask the Brits rather than Belgium.
Yeah, sure, but you must have an idea.
Well, it's because they realize that since we do not have any cooperation mechanism through the EU, that's gone. Mm-hmm. It was their wish, it's gone. Now maybe it's time to think of other ways of still cooperating together. You know, I said Britain is 60 kilometers away from Belgium, but Belgium is also 60 kilometers away from Britain.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you. All right, here is the second question.
I'm sorry about being so persistent, but I was also wondering, since you come from Belgium, and you did mention that Belgium is very keen on this idea of an integrated and united Europe, how does it see, you know, the candidates from the former Yugoslav countries, or even, for example, some Caucasus countries like Georgia? How does it see those countries coming into the equation of Europe? Would they want them to join the European Union someday in the future? Or is it not much of a priority for Belgium?
So there are two different aspects: principle, so theory, and reality. In theory, the EU has been very clear. All countries belonging to the former Yugoslavia are candidate to the EU, and they are welcome. That's the principle we have affirmed at least 20 years ago. Nothing new. But we have also said, and on this, different European member states could differ in the speed they want to proceed. But here in Belgium, we're very clear, because 20 years ago, we said, you are welcome, and here are the conditions if you want to join the club. It's not a negotiation where we would meet somewhere in the middle. No, you want to become a member of the club, here are the rules of the club, and you have to strictly adhere to these rules. If you don't, you just have to wait, or you don't enter. And we still have this attitude. So for Belgium, they are absolutely welcome as soon as they fulfill all the conditions. And we have to just see that, unfortunately, some of these countries are still far away of meeting any condition.
Yeah. Yep.
No,
Oh, sure.
two other
There's a,
questions.
yeah, there's a gentleman.
So if I could just kind of follow up a bit on the previous Britain question. So I know that when Britain was a part of the EU, they were one of the main obstacles towards, I guess, the EU becoming more centralized, like being opposed to like the single currency. Given Brexit, do you see Europe as becoming more of a United States of Europe now, rather than kind of like a supranational organization?
You know, your question just led me to the conclusion. It's just incredible that intelligent people like the Brits and the Americans still adhere to that type of myth. You're living in another reality. I'm sorry. We've been a founding member and
This works.
is it still working?
Yep.
So you're living in another world. I'm sorry. I mentioned that our goal as Belgians is the United States of Europe. I clearly said that there is just one of the member states sharing that goal, and that is Luxembourg. It means that 25 member states do not agree with that goal. And we fully respect that because we are all democracies. So what this all myth about centralizing power in Brussels, it's a myth created by, I'm sorry, the English-speaking press. You simply do not know our reality. One of the basic principles in the EU treaty is subsidiarity. The EU can only handle issues that are given to it by all member states unanimously. And so when Britain was a member, indeed, there are so many issues that the Brits did not want to be tackled at the EU level. And sometimes when there was a strong desire by many other member states, like the currency, we just told the Brit, okay, let us move forward and we accept that you will have an exception. And we agreed in the Maastricht Treaty, okay, Britain will not need to be part of the currency. And it was never mentioned. And now, you know, our surprise about Brexit is that Britain got absolutely everything it wanted from the EU, the single market, not a member of Schengen, not a member of the euro currency, so many exceptions when it comes to Schengen. Not a member of Schengen. So you got absolutely everything. You got enlargement before deepening. Totally the opposite of our Belgian position. And still you left. We respect it, but we simply do not understand sometimes. You're living in another world, I'm sorry.
I think I agree with that. Thank you. Let's go and get some online questions. And we are exhausting you a lot. So let's have a few more questions and then we'll finish it.
Yeah, we just have one last one from online from Philip Blatt, who asks about Brussels' stance on climate change. Obviously, this is an issue that impacts the rest of the world, but we're curious how Belgium in particular faces climate change and tries to handle it internally.
Yeah. It's a major issue in Belgian politics, but I would say in Belgian society. Just to give you an example, we have currently a coalition of 7 parties in parliament forming the government, and 2 of them are green parties, one from the Flemish north, one from the French-speaking south. And of course, it means that these are relatively strong parties in terms of votes. But also, if I talk to my daughter and I listen to my daughter, she would mention about almost any other theme, and what about the environment? Because that's the world I am going to live in. And so, especially among the younger generation, this is a strong feeling. And so there is a pressure, not just on the government, but also on industries, on transport, whatever, just to improve the situation in terms of climate change. And it's about the way, for example, we have selective trash, right? So when I was a kid, there was just 1 trash bag in the kitchen. Now in Brussels, I have 4. but I adapted, right? I just need to evolve with what was living around me. And as long as you understand and the objective, I think that you can go along. But that's a transition process. It happens step by step. It does not happen overnight. And that's something also I think our population understand, is that we have to move towards. So for example, we're also moving towards closing nuclear plants. It's not about climate change, it's about nuclear waste, but the population does not like it, but still does want have power tomorrow night, right? So we have a longer term objective. Right now it is by 2025, we should close our nuclear plants, but maybe we should keep them 2 or 3 more years in case it is needed to avoid a blackout. It's not easy, it's a challenge. We're fully participating in the EU policy. We are providing finance to mitigate climate change in the rest of the world, especially in poorer countries. But we recognize it's a challenge. For example, internally in Belgium, we have a national objective in terms of reducing CO2, but then we have to break it down by region. And then it becomes very sensitive politically. Should you count according to the population, according to GDP, according to former emissions? It's very tricky because it means that we impose ourselves objective. And of course, you always want your neighbor to do more than yourself. So it's not easy, but we all believe in Belgium, at least a very large portion of the population, that it is absolutely necessary.
Thank you. Let's have 1 or 2 final questions, then we go home. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Joshua Horton. Considering that China is the 2nd largest economy in the world, and the world needs to work with China to solve existential problems like climate change, what would a hardline stance against China actually look like?
So I'm not sure I understood the question properly. So you mentioned that in order to solve some issues like climate change, we need cooperation with China.
Yes.
But it seems to be in contradiction with the arch stance on China.
Well, I'm asking, you mentioned earlier that perhaps the West needs to have a, quote, hardline stance against China. And so I'm asking, if we need to work with China, like what would that stance look like in practical terms?
But on which issue? On climate change or on other issues?
Not necessarily climate change, more on like security issues, not specifically just climate change.
That's very broad. If you want to discuss all policy issues we might have with China. I think, as I mentioned, it's a common European policy that we want to improve the dialogue we have with China. We have differences. We might have even serious challenges. I just mentioned, for example, intellectual property. But we hope we will be able to devise common mechanisms with the Chinese in order to come to a satisfactory solution for both sides. We don't want to turn China into a desert. We want to have a fair competition and a fair cooperation. We have the feeling that it's not entirely fair. Now, I'm also ready to listen to the Chinese views, and let's try to see where we can go together on these issues. Now, when it comes to climate change, it's a bit different. I think that we all agree that it is a challenge. Environmental issues are a big challenge for the Chinese government itself within China. And actually, Chinese, not being stupid, they even developed quite an industry. For example, when it comes to solar panels, to the point that we have an issue, a trade issue with China because we believe it's too subsidized and the market practices are not fair. And so that's certainly a field where we can cooperate and it could even improve the situation within China when it comes to the environment. But let's cooperate. It's obvious that we will all benefit from such a cooperation.
Thank you. One final question. Yes, please.
Here. Yeah. You mentioned that, of course, the EU's main goal is security, and everything must be unanimous. I'm wondering, is there a growing sentiment within the EU that the Ukraine is more of a liability than an asset when it comes to security in terms of letting them in?
No, I would say that really the principle of respect is the fundamental we see. Because if, you know, it's not just about Ukraine, it's about all of us. Because if there is no respect for Ukraine, there could be a lack of respect for any of us. And so we simply cannot accept it. And we all realize that it is by standing together to this type of pressure that we will deserve the respect we want.
Thank you very much for these very good and insightful words, which I think we all would agree with. Thank you very much for a great performance, both in the questions and, of course, your talk at the beginning. Thank you, Ambassador Stephenson, for participating in the panel discussion. Thank you for coming tonight, listening to us and discussing with us. I would like to mention that our next Krasno event is on April the 19th. And that will be the Northern Ireland representative in Washington, D.C., who will come to see us and talk about peace and reconciliation, and also about the problems the EU has with the UK about Northern Ireland. So this promises also to be a very exciting topic. And I would like to invite you all to come back, also our Zoom audience, of course. I hope you will be able to come back on April 19th. Thank you very much. Good night to everyone in the Mandela Auditorium. Good night to everyone who was watching us on Zoom tonight. And thank you very much again to Ambassador Regibeau of Belgium for coming and seeing us tonight. Thank you.